My boss laughed, refusing to let me ride in his Rolls-Royce, mocking that I didn't deserve it. Minutes later, a fleet of luxury cars arrived, sent by my billionaire father. His smirk vanished when I handed him my resignation letter, revealing I had just bought out the company he worked for. The laughter hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from amusement or shared joy. No, this was something else entirely, mocking, sharp, dripping with arrogance. It echoed in the parking lot, bouncing off the polished exteriors of luxury cars lined up under the bright office lights. All I had said was, "One day I'll sit in a car like this." It wasn't even a serious statement. More of a test. A quiet observation. Maybe even an attempt to see if James Caldwell, my boss, had the kind of leadership that inspired people. Instead of encouragement, I got laughter. Loud, unapologetic, demeaning laughter. James leaned against his Rolls-Royce, his fingers tracing the gold-trimmed door handle as he shook his head. "You," he scoffed. "In a car like this?" He tilted his head slightly, smirking. "Do you have any idea how much this costs? $2 million. Fully customized. You think people like you get to sit in something like this?" The words should have made me angry. Instead, they made me cold. James thought he knew who I was. He had no idea. A few months earlier, I sat in the vast dining hall of my family's Harrington estate, the golden glow of the chandelier above us casting a soft light on the table set for two. The usual spread was before me: dry-aged steak, truffle mashed potatoes, a bottle of vintage wine my father always poured but I never drank. Across from me sat Richard Harrington, my father. A man who wasn't just powerful, he was the kind of powerful that made people afraid. A self-made billionaire who had built an empire from the ground up. I had grown up in his world. Private jets. Five-star hotels. Security teams that shadowed my every move. I had never known struggle, never felt what it meant to need something I couldn't have. And that was the problem. I picked at my food, gathering my thoughts. My father noticed, his sharp eyes scanning my face. "You look like you have something to say." I took a breath. "I want to work for a real company." He barely glanced up. "You already do." I exhaled, shaking my head. "Not Harrington Enterprises. Not anything connected to our name. I want to work somewhere normal. Somewhere I can prove myself without people bowing the moment they hear who I am." That made him pause. Slowly, he set his fork down, his gaze locking onto mine with curiosity, then something else. Amusement. "Why?" "Because I don't want my success to be handed to me. I want to earn it." For a moment he just watched me, expression unreadable. Then with a slow smirk he leaned back in his chair. "And you think the world will treat you fairly?" I stiffened. "I think I at least deserve to try." His smirk faded slightly. "Isabella, you don't know what you're asking for." "I do." "No," he said, swirling his wine glass. "You don't. You think struggle is romantic because you've never actually faced it. You think the world operates on fairness, on merit. It doesn't." I didn't flinch. "Then let me see that for myself." Silence stretched between us. Then finally he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "All right. But you'll be back." I wasn't sure if it was a challenge or a warning. The next morning I expected my father to try to change my mind. Instead, when I came down for breakfast, he handed me a manila folder. "These are some companies you can apply to." I frowned. "I don't want your help." "I'm not helping." He sipped his coffee. "These places don't know who you are. You'll get in or not, based on your own merit." I studied him carefully. Something about this felt too easy. "And you won't interfere?" His smirk deepened. "Not unless I have to." I should have known that wasn't a real promise. My father never left things to chance. I stripped away every trace of my wealth. No designer clothes. No luxury handbags. No expensive jewelry. I replaced my high-end wardrobe with simple, inexpensive business attire. Nothing flashy, nothing that hinted at my real background. Even my name was different. No one would know me as Isabella Harrington. Now I was simply Isa Martin. An ordinary woman. The first time I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. Gone were the effortless elegance, the polished perfection. In its place was someone raw, someone untested. And I felt free. With my resume in hand, I stepped into a world I had never known. I applied to 4 different companies. The first rejection came within hours. The second company didn't even call me back. The third had me sit through a long, grueling interview, only for them to hire someone who had a family connection to the CEO. I had never experienced rejection like this before. Never felt the sting of being unseen, overlooked. For the first time in my life, I was just another face in the crowd. First it hurt. Then it ignited something inside me. I wasn't going to let this world tell me what I couldn't do. I wasn't going to fail. After weeks of dead ends, I finally got a call. A mid-sized company, Sterling and Company, wanted to interview me for an administrative assistant position. Not glamorous. Not leadership. But a foot in the door. I stepped into the office for my first day feeling something foreign. Nervousness. No one whispered my name. No one tried to impress me. I was just another employee. Unnoticed. Unimportant. And I loved it. For the first time, I was free from expectations. Free to build something on my own. I had no idea what awaited me in the months ahead. I didn't know that one single moment, a conversation in a parking lot, a man's arrogance, would change everything. That the girl James Caldwell mocked would soon own everything he thought was his. But for now I was just Isa Martin. And my story was only beginning. I stepped into the office for my first day feeling something foreign. Nervousness. No one whispered my name. No one tried to impress me. I was just another employee. Unnoticed. Unimportant. And I loved it. For the first time I was free from expectations. Free to build something on my own. But that freedom came with a price. A price I hadn't fully understood until I faced the first brutal truth of the real world. Merit alone doesn't guarantee success. The moment I started applying for jobs, reality hit me harder than I expected. At first, I walked into interviews with confidence, armed with my carefully crafted resume and the knowledge I had spent years absorbing. I had studied business since I was a teenager. I had seen billion-dollar deals happen in my own house. But none of that mattered in these rooms. I sat through one cold, indifferent interview after another, facing hiring managers who barely looked up from my resume. One man, a middle-aged executive from Garrison Tech, tapped his pen against the table as he skimmed my qualifications. "No prior corporate experience?" he asked flatly. "I've studied business models, market strategies, and economic trends independently." He cut me off with a tight-lipped smile. "We're looking for candidates with hands-on experience." The interview ended in under 7 minutes. The next company, Hawthorne Marketing, barely let me finish introducing myself before politely telling me they'd keep my resume on file. The third interview at Everton Financial felt promising, until I overheard the receptionist whispering about the CEO's nephew, who had already been promised the position. By the end of my third rejection, the weight of anonymity started to settle over me like a heavy fog. For the first time I was experiencing something I had never felt before. Being invisible. The weeks dragged on, each rejection cutting a little deeper. I sat in my apartment, staring at my inbox, hoping for any response that wasn't another automated rejection email. "Thank you for your application. Unfortunately, we have chosen to proceed with other candidates at this time." The polite way of saying, "You weren't good enough." I set my laptop aside, leaning back against the couch. For the first time, I asked myself the question I had never dared to before. Was I only valuable because of my father's name? Had I been delusional to think I could do this on my own? I had always believed that hard work mattered. That effort and intelligence were the keys to success. But the world I was stepping into wasn't a meritocracy. It was a battlefield, and I was fighting without the one weapon I had always relied on: privilege. I refused to let that defeat me. If the world wouldn't open its doors for me, I would kick them down myself. A week later, I finally got a call. "Hello, is this Isa Martin?" I straightened, gripping my phone tightly. "Yes, this is Isa. This is Stephanie from Sterling and Company. We reviewed your application and would like to invite you for an interview." I nearly dropped the phone. Finally. The next day, I walked into Sterling and Company, a mid-sized business consulting firm. It wasn't a Fortune 500 company, but it was stable, reputable. The hiring manager, Olivia Carter, gave me a long, assessing look before gesturing for me to sit. "Tell me why you want to work here." This time I didn't hesitate. "Because I want to learn. Because I work harder than anyone. And because I believe I can bring value to your company." She didn't smile, but I saw something shift in her expression. The rest of the interview went smoothly, and 2 days later I got the call. I had a job. Not glamorous. Not high-paying. But it was a start. My first day at Sterling and Company was a shock to my system. I had expected a structured, professional environment. Instead, I was thrown into a whirlwind of endless emails, phone calls, meetings, and administrative chaos. As an administrative assistant, my tasks were far from exciting. Scheduling appointments, organizing reports, answering calls. But I refused to let that define me. I stayed late, volunteered for extra tasks, absorbed every detail I could. I listened carefully in meetings, took notes on how managers made decisions, studied every financial report I handled. I worked harder than anyone else. At first no one noticed. Then slowly they did. A senior analyst, Miriam Evans, nodded at me one afternoon as I handed her an updated report. "You're sharp," I say. "You catch on fast." It was the first real compliment I had received since starting. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. As the weeks passed, I started to see the ugly side of corporate life. It wasn't just about who worked the hardest. It was about who knew the right people. I watched as employees who barely put in effort got promotions because they were close with management. I saw office politics in action. Favoritism, alliances, quiet power plays. One afternoon, I overheard two senior employees talking in the break room. "Did you hear? Mason got the promotion." "Of course he did. His uncle is on the board." I clenched my jaw, pretending to be focused on my coffee. This wasn't how I had imagined things would be. I had spent my whole life believing that success was earned. But in this world, it was often handed out to the right people. People with connections. And James Caldwell, my boss, was the perfect example of that. Charismatic. Charming. Liked by the higher-ups. But he wasn't a leader. He was a performer. And I had a feeling he already saw me as expendable. I refused to let that happen. I wasn't here to play office politics. I was here to win. As I left the office that night, I felt something shift inside me. I had faced rejection. I had doubted myself. I had seen how the system was rigged. But I wasn't going to let it define me. I had earned my place here. And no one, not James Caldwell, not office politics, not the weight of my father's legacy, was going to take that from me. I just didn't know yet that the real challenge was still ahead. That the man who dismissed me as just another employee would soon learn exactly who I was. I tapped my fingers on the keyboard, my eyes scanning the spreadsheet on my screen. The numbers blurred slightly from staring too long, but I forced myself to focus. No mistakes. No second chances. The hum of office chatter filled the background. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, muffled conversations. It had been weeks since I started at Sterling and Company, and I had already learned one thing. You either stood out or got swallowed whole. I refused to be invisible. I took on more work than necessary, volunteering for extra tasks before anyone could ask. Someone needed a report organized. I had it done. A client meeting needed last-minute prep. I stayed late. The first few weeks no one noticed. Then slowly they did. Miriam Evans, a senior analyst, stopped by my desk one morning, dropping a thick file onto my keyboard. "You're sharp," I say. "Think you can summarize this report before my meeting at noon?" I glanced at the 60-page document. A challenge. Perfect. Absolutely. By 11:45, I handed her a polished, concise summary. No errors. No fluff. She flipped through it, then glanced at me. Not bad. That was it. No grand praise. No instant recognition. But I had learned that in this world, respect wasn't handed out. It was earned. And I was just getting started. I didn't just do my job, I studied everything. During meetings, I took notes not just on what was being said, but how decisions were made, which numbers mattered, what strategies succeeded. I spent lunch breaks reading financial reports instead of scrolling my phone. I memorized the company's revenue trends, market shifts, client behavior. One afternoon, I overheard two employees in the break room discussing an upcoming campaign. The client wants a new ad strategy, but sales aren't strong enough for a risky push. I spoke up before I could stop myself. Why not adjust the pricing model instead of changing the ads? If the discount threshold shifts by just 5%, it could increase conversions without requiring a full rebranding. They blinked at me. One of them, a marketing executive named Daniel Carter, raised an eyebrow. "You're an admin. How do you know that?" I shrugged. "I read the reports." There was a pause. Then without a word, he grabbed a pen and wrote something down. 2 weeks later, that same pricing model was implemented. And it worked. No one credited me. But I didn't care. Because I knew. And more importantly, so did they. It didn't take long to see how the real game was played. It wasn't just about who worked the hardest. It was about who had influence. One afternoon, I walked into the break room just as a conversation caught my ear. James Caldwell is moving up fast. I paused, pretending to check my phone. Of course he is. He's got the higher-ups eating out of his hand. James Caldwell, my boss. Charismatic, well-dressed, charming on the surface. But underneath, ruthless. Calculated. I saw it in the way he spoke to people. One tone for the executives, another for the employees beneath him. He knew exactly who to impress and who to step over. And the worst part? It worked. Promotions weren't given to the most talented employees. They were given to those who played the game. I wasn't willing to manipulate my way up. But I wasn't going to let people like James control everything either. Trying to prove myself came at a price. The first month I barely noticed. I was staying late, skipping meals, pushing myself harder than I ever had. By the second month it started to show. I woke up one morning feeling like my head was stuffed with cotton. My alarm had been blaring for 10 minutes before I realized it. I dragged myself out of bed, chugging coffee before racing to work. That day I made my first mistake. A minor error in a client report, barely noticeable, but in this office mistakes weren't overlooked. Miriam caught it. She didn't yell, didn't criticize. She just said, "You're better than this, is it?" And that hurt more than if she had shouted. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my reflection. Dark circles under my eyes. Shoulders slumped. For the first time I asked myself, was this worth it? Then I remembered James Caldwell's smug smile, the way he dismissed people like me. And I straightened. Yes, it was. As I climbed higher, I started to see the cracks. Not just in the company but in the entire system. Underpaid employees, overworked teams, leaders who thrived on power instead of competence. One afternoon I watched as a coworker, Ethan, a financial analyst, pleaded for a raise. He had been working here for 5 years. James shrugged. There's no room in the budget. 2 days later, James approved a luxury corporate retreat for senior management. I clenched my fist. The system was built to keep people like Ethan struggling while people like James thrived. And for the first time I felt it, a slow, simmering anger. Not just at James. Not just at the system. At myself. Because I had spent my whole life unaware of how the world really worked. Now I saw it clearly. And I wasn't going to ignore it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment. Every unfair promotion. Every underappreciated employee. Every smug smile from James Caldwell. I had entered this world to prove I could succeed without my father's name. But now it wasn't just about success. It was about changing the game. I had spent months learning, watching, understanding. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. It was time to use it. Because James Caldwell had spent his whole career believing people like me weren't a threat. That was about to change. He just didn't know it yet. The office lights flickered off one by one as employees trickled out, their conversations fading into the crisp evening air. I gathered my things, tucking my laptop into my bag before glancing at the time. 8:37 p.m. Another late night. The parking lot stretched ahead of me, a sea of cars under the dim glow of streetlights. I had barely taken a few steps when the low, familiar purr of an engine caught my attention. I turned just in time to see James Caldwell stepping out of the building, his usual air of confidence wrapped around him like an expensive suit. But tonight there was something extra, a smugness that practically dripped from his every movement. And then I saw it. A brand new Rolls-Royce, sleek, black with custom gold accents, parked right at the front. The kind of car that turned heads. The kind of car that screamed power, wealth, superiority. James walked toward it with the effortless ease of a man who believed he owned the world. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, flashing a gold wristwatch that probably cost more than my entire annual salary. A few employees still lingering outside whispered among themselves, their gazes flicking between him and the luxury vehicle. For some reason I felt compelled to say something. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a test. Maybe, deep down, I just wanted to see if James had an ounce of encouragement in him. I took a few steps toward the car, my expression neutral but my voice light-hearted. One day I'll sit in a car like this. The words were meant to be harmless. Maybe even an attempt to start a normal human conversation. But the reaction I got was anything but normal. James stopped, his hand frozen on the door handle, and turned toward me. For a split second, his expression was unreadable. Then without warning he laughed. Not a chuckle. Not an amused smirk. A full, loud, unapologetic laugh. It echoed in the parking lot, bouncing off the surrounding cars, slicing through the evening air like a blade. My stomach twisted. A few employees turned to watch, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet discomfort. James finally caught his breath, shaking his head as if he had just heard the funniest joke of his life. "You," he scoffed. "In a car like this?" I should have walked away. But I didn't. I stood there, my hands tucked into my coat pockets, my face carefully blank. James leaned against the Rolls-Royce, still smirking. "Do you even know how much this costs?" he asked, amusement dripping from every word. $2 million. Fully customized. Every detail handcrafted. And you think someone like you will ever sit in something like this? I clenched my jaw, but I didn't speak. That only seemed to entertain him more. You barely make enough to afford a decent apartment." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "What, do you think hard work alone gets you this?" The laughter from a few nearby employees stung more than his words. Because they didn't laugh with me. They laughed at me. James let out a final, mocking sigh before sliding into the driver's seat, the leather interior swallowing him whole. The engine purred to life, smooth and effortless as he rolled down the window, looking at me one last time. "Keep dreaming, you say." And then he was gone. I didn't move right away. I just stood there, my heartbeat steady, my face unreadable. Not because I wanted the car. Not because I envied the wealth. But because I had expected something different. After all the late nights. After the endless hours of proving myself, of showing that I wasn't just another invisible employee, I had expected at least a shred of acknowledgement. Instead, I had been reduced to nothing in a single conversation. James hadn't just laughed at me. He had reminded me exactly how he saw me. Not as a rising professional. Not as a competitor. As a nobody. I still didn't move. I barely noticed the cold biting at my fingers, or the distant sound of another car engine starting. My mind replayed the moment over and over again. James's laughter. His voice dripping with arrogance. The way he didn't even consider the possibility that I could be more than just an employee with a small paycheck. And then something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder. Something sharper. I had spent months working harder than anyone in that office. I had put in the hours. I had taken on the impossible workload. And still, James saw me as nothing more than a background character in his story. Fine. Let him think that. Because he had no idea who I really was. And soon he would. That night I didn't go home and cry. I didn't rage, didn't vent, didn't let the humiliation sink into my bones. I did one thing. I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen for a moment before dialing the number I had avoided calling for months. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Isabella. I closed my eyes at the sound of my father's voice. For the first time, I wasn't calling him as the daughter proving she could do this on her own. I was calling him as the woman who was ready for the next step. Dad, I exhaled, my voice steady. I'm ready. There was a pause. Then I heard it, the faintest trace of a smirk in his voice. I was wondering how long it would take you to say that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. The moment in the parking lot replayed in my head like a scene from a movie. James's laughter. His words. His absolute certainty that I would always be beneath him. But soon he would see. Soon, everything he thought was his would belong to me. He just didn't know it yet. And that was what made the game even sweeter. By the time the first streaks of dawn broke through my window, my decision was firm. It was time. I got up, took a long shower, and changed into the one thing I had sworn off for months. Power. No more blending in. No more being invisible. Today I was stepping forward. At precisely 8 a.m., the quiet morning routine of Sterling and Company was shattered. A convoy of sleek black luxury cars pulled up in front of the office, their polished surfaces gleaming under the rising sun. The employees stopped in their tracks. Conversations halted, coffee cups hovered mid-sip. The first door opened and a man stepped out. Richard Harrington. Dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, his presence alone commanded the entire space. The kind of presence that turned whispers into stunned silence, that made people straighten their backs instinctively. People who had never even met him knew who he was. And behind him, stepping out of the second car, was me. Not Isa Martin, the assistant. Not Isa, the overworked employee who had spent months proving herself. Isabella Harrington. I walked beside my father, my heels clicking against the pavement, my face unreadable. The whispers grew louder. That's Richard Harrington. Why is he here? And who, wait, is that Isa? The office doors swung open before we even reached them. Inside, employees hurried to clear the way, their confusion turning into speculation. And then we walked toward the conference room, where James Caldwell was waiting. James sat at the long, polished conference table, smug as ever. He didn't even look up right away, assuming this was just another high-level meeting. A discussion about company growth. A possible merger. Something that would put him one step closer to the promotion he thought he deserved. And then he saw my father. I caught the exact moment his confidence flickered. His posture stiffened slightly, his brows furrowing as he adjusted his tie. I sat down directly across from him. My father took the seat at the head of the table. The rest of the executives were already there, their faces a mix of anticipation and unease. My father set down a folder, opened it with slow precision, and then spoke in his signature calm, controlled voice. As of this morning, Sterling and Company is under new ownership. The room fell silent. Someone shifted in their chair. James blinked, his smirk faltering. What? Richard leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. Harrington Enterprises has acquired a majority stake in the company. As of today, we own it. I didn't move. Didn't speak. I watched. James sat there staring at my father, trying to process the words. And then his gaze snapped to me. Finally, he realized. The arrogance drained from his face as it clicked. The assistant he had dismissed, the employee he had laughed at, she wasn't just another worker. She owned him now. The color in his face shifted, his confidence fracturing beneath the weight of reality. James turned to the executives, searching for some kind of response, but they were just as stunned. This wasn't just a promotion. This was an empire shift. One of the senior executives cleared his throat, breaking the silence. And who will be overseeing the transition? Richard glanced at me, then leaned forward slightly. Isabella. James's jaw clenched. I lifted my chin, my expression smooth, unreadable. The man who had mocked me, underestimated me, laughed at me, now had to answer to me. He leaned back slightly, trying to reassemble his composure. This is a joke, he said, his voice hollow. I say, Isabella, you don't have experience running a company like this. I tilted my head slightly. And yet here I am. His hands clenched into fists against the table. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? I gave him a slow, steady look. No, James. I didn't waltz in. I worked my way in. The air crackled with tension. He knew. Every second of every late night. Every extra effort. Every moment he had dismissed me. I had used it. Turned it into fuel. And now I was here. At the top. I reached into my bag, pulling out a single sheet of paper. James's eyes flicked to it, then back to me. I slid it across the table. My resignation letter. Silence. For a brief second, I saw confusion flash in his eyes. And then, before he could speak, I leaned forward slightly, my voice even. You should have treated your employees better, James. He said nothing. He couldn't. Because he knew. He knew that this wasn't just about power. It was about a lesson. I wasn't here to take over. I was here to show him exactly what he had overlooked. He had laughed at me. Dismissed me. And now he sat across from me, watching as I walked away, on my own terms. I stood, straightened my blazer, and turned toward my father. You don't need me to handle this. You know what to do. He gave me a slow nod, a hint of pride in his gaze. James sat frozen in his chair, struggling to regain control of the situation. But it was over. I didn't need revenge. I had already won. As I walked out of the conference room, I could still hear the whispers. She was working here all along? James really had no idea? She just walked away, like she was in control the entire time. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air, breathing in the moment. I had started this journey to prove something to myself. And now I had. The assistant James Caldwell mocked. Had just changed everything. The cold morning air filled my lungs as I stepped outside. the glass doors of Sterling and Company shutting behind me with a quiet finality. The echoes of whispers and stunned silence still lingered inside, but out here I felt something else entirely: freedom. 4 months, I had pushed myself harder than I ever thought possible, proving to myself that I was more than a last name, more than an heiress playing dress-up in the corporate world. Now I was walking away on my own terms. But my story wasn't just about proving something to myself anymore. It was about changing the game. As I walked toward my father's waiting car, I could hear the sharp sound of his footsteps behind me. He wasn't in a hurry, nor was he rushing to catch up. He was waiting to see what I would do next. I turned to face him, holding his gaze. "You don't need me for this," I said. "You already know what needs to be done." He smirked. "I do. But I'm curious, what would you do if you stayed?" For a moment I considered it. Sterling and Company was a company built on hierarchy, office politics, and manipulation. Employees like James thrived while hard-working individuals, people like Ethan, Miriam, and the dozens of others I had come to respect, were left fighting for scraps. I had seen the cracks. I had seen how the system was rigged in favor of the undeserving. And for the first time I realized something important. I could fix it. I wasn't just someone who had observed the flaws. I was someone who could change them. I didn't want James's job. I wanted to rebuild the entire foundation. I turned back to my father, my decision clear. "I'd strip out the corruption," I said. "Cut the dead weight. Make sure people are rewarded based on merit, not connections." My father raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And James?" A slow smile formed on my lips. "He's already done enough damage. Let him see what it's like to be on the outside looking in." Richard nodded once, then pulled out his phone. "Consider it handled." I should have left right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I turned on my heel and walked back inside, my steps steady, my mind sharp. James was still in the conference room, the other executives slowly trickling out, their faces unreadable. He was standing now, one hand braced against the table, his face a mixture of disbelief and something else: fear. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. For the first time, James didn't look at me with arrogance. He looked at me with uncertainty. "So that's it," he said, his voice tight. "You humiliate me in front of the entire company and now you're just leaving?" I tilted my head, studying him. "This isn't about humiliation, James. It's about consequences." He let out a short laugh, but it lacked his usual confidence. "Consequences for what?" "Not giving you a ride in my car." I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but firm. "For underestimating people. For taking advantage of a broken system. For believing that you were untouchable." His jaw clenched. "You don't deserve to be in that chair," I continued. "And now, you won't be." James swallowed, his hands curling into fists. "What happens to me now?" I exhaled slowly, my gaze steady. "That's up to you." Because the truth was, James had built his success on manipulation and arrogance. Now, without those things, he would have to figure out who he really was. And that was a lesson only he could learn. By noon, the restructuring had begun. James's immediate termination was the first step. The second, overhauling the corporate structure. I sat with my father's transition team, going through files, spreadsheets, and company policies. I made sure every single promotion was reviewed, every shady deal was uncovered. Employees like Ethan, people who had spent years working tirelessly with no recognition, were finally given what they deserved. I watched as people realized that the rules had changed. No more favoritism. No more office politics. For the first time in Sterling and Company's history, hard work actually mattered. By the end of the week, the energy in the office had completely shifted. People walked through the halls differently. Lighter. More confident. Ethan stopped me near the elevator, his usual stress lines smoothed out. "I don't know what you did, but thank you." I gave him a small smile. "Don't thank me. Just do what you've always done. Prove why you deserve to be here." He nodded, and for the first time I saw real hope in his eyes. The people who had spent years playing fair and losing finally had a chance to win. And that was more satisfying than any revenge could ever be. As much as I had changed things, I knew one truth. This company wasn't my future. I had proven what I needed to prove. Now it was time to move forward. On my final day, I stood by the massive windows looking out over the city. I had started as an invisible employee. Now I was walking away as a force to be reckoned with. Miriam found me just before I left. She didn't say much, just gave me a knowing look before offering her hand. You did good, I say. I shook it, a quiet understanding passing between us. Then I picked up my bag and walked out for the last time. As I stepped outside, my father was already waiting by the car. I slid into the passenger seat, exhaling slowly. So, he said, starting the engine. What's next for you? I turned to face him, my expression calm but determined. Something of my own. He glanced at me, then smiled. I thought you might say that. I watched as the office building grew smaller in the distance. I had walked in as a nobody. I was leaving as someone who had rewritten the rules. James Caldwell had believed that I didn't deserve success. But success wasn't about what you were born into. It was about what you built for yourself. No. I was ready to build something even bigger.